The year was 1305. In the shadowed alleys and crooked rooftops of London, the morning sun rose over a city humming with anticipation. But it wasn't a royal parade or a coronation that had drawn the people out so early. It was something darker, something bloodier. Today, the capital would witness the death of a man whose very name stirred rebellion. William Wallace. He was not a king, not a nobleman cloaked in fine velvet or born of lineage traced through golden parchments. He was a minor landowner, a man shaped by loss and fire, whose hands had held not courtly rings, but the steel of resistance. And yet, he had become England's greatest threat. A decade before, the winds of change had begun to blow across the highlands of Scotland. The kingdom was fractured, leaderless after a bitter succession crisis. English armies under King Edward I, Longshanks, the ruthless, swept in like a plague, demanding allegiance and crushing those who refused. But one man stood in defiance. Wallace emerged from obscurity in 1297, not with an army, but with a cry for freedom. At Stirling Bridge, he led a ragtag force of farmers, woodsmen, and forgotten men against England's feared heavy cavalry, and won. It wasn't just a military triumph. It was a miracle, a beacon, a whisper across every Scottish glen. We can fight. We can win. To Edward I, this was intolerable. Wallace wasn't just a soldier. He was dangerous because he was an idea that loyalty could be earned, not imposed, that a people could live without kneeling. In the years that followed, Wallace became a hunted man, a phantom that haunted the English war machine. While Scotland's nobles bent the knee one by one, Wallace kept his blade drawn. He refused titles. He refused compromise. He fought not for a crown but for a country. But ideas, no matter how powerful, can be betrayed. Now, in 1305, William Wallace had been captured, betrayed not by enemy steel, but by the greed and fear of his own countrymen. He was dragged in chains across the land he once defended, through jeering crowds and guarded roadways, to the heart of English power, London. And here, in this sprawling, filthy city, the people gathered. Thousands pressed against one another, straining for a glimpse of the man whose name had become legend. The execution was being prepared with almost ceremonial precision. Not simply to end a life, but to erase a symbol. What they had come to witness was not justice. It was annihilation. And yet, as Wallace was led into the city, bruised but unbowed, he did not beg. He did not tremble. Because even in chains, he remained what England feared most. A free man. King Edward I of England, called Longshanks for his towering frame, was not a man accustomed to defiance. A warrior, a lawmaker, and a tyrant in equal measure, he had spent his reign crushing those who dared to oppose him. He had silenced the Welsh with steel, expelled the Jews with cruelty, and carved his authority into every corner of Britain. But William Wallace was different. This wasn't a man seeking power or title. Wallace was a symbol, a spark. He had united the fractured clans of Scotland, not with gold or birthright, but with the language of resistance. And to Edward, symbols were more dangerous than swords. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge had enraged the king. Not just because it was a military loss, but because it was a public embarrassment. The great armies of England had been outmaneuvered by a peasant general. And worse, Wallace had done it in the name of Scottish independence, a word that Edward refused to acknowledge. So, when Wallace was finally captured, the king saw an opportunity, not merely to end a life but to send a message carved into flesh, branded into history, and soaked into the soil of every Scottish village. He did not want Wallace to vanish quietly. He wanted him to scream. Edward ordered the most horrifying punishment in his arsenal: hanging, disembowelment, and quartering. This wasn't justice. It was ritualized torture, a state-sponsored performance of agony meant to terrify anyone who might dream of rebellion. The symbolism was precise. To be hanged but not killed meant rejection by heaven. To be disemboweled while alive meant corruption of the soul. To be beheaded and quartered meant total erasure. No martyrdom, no burial, no legacy. Each act was chosen not to kill quickly, but to destroy slowly, to break the man, the myth, and every heart that beat in time with his cause. Edward's council hesitated. There were whispers that such brutality might backfire, that Wallace's death could birth a martyr. But the king dismissed them. He was not interested in caution. He was interested in fear. In a letter written to his justiciars, Edward described the execution as necessary for the security of the realm. But behind those words was something colder. This was Edward's revenge. Not for a battlefield lost, but for a challenge to his authority. Personal vendetta wrapped in royal decree. Preparations were made. The execution would be public, prolonged, and unforgettable. From the moment Wallace entered London, his final journey was crafted not by torturers, but by architects of terror. This wasn't simply about ending William Wallace. It was about turning his body into a warning, his breath into ash, his scream into silence, and his name into a forbidden memory that would linger, trembling, in the shadows of every man who ever dreamed of freedom. For years, William Wallace had fought like a ghost, appearing, striking, and vanishing before English hands could close around him. He had evaded armies, slipped past patrols, and endured through cold, hunger, and grief. But in the end, it wasn't English steel that caught him. It was betrayal. The year was 1305. The fire of Scottish rebellion had dimmed, and most nobles had bowed their heads to King Edward. The once proud alliances were fractured, scattered like broken shields. And Wallace, still burning with the dream of freedom, found himself increasingly alone. He was hunted relentlessly. Spies flooded the countryside. English coin flowed freely into the hands of the desperate and the greedy. Every step Wallace took, every ally he sought was shadowed by doubt. And then, near Glasgow, the net finally closed. History points to Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot, once a comrade, now a puppet of the English crown. Whether out of fear, ambition, or cold calculation, Menteith delivered Wallace into the enemy's grasp. No blade was drawn, no glorious last stand, just shackles, silence, and a heart splintering under the weight of treachery. But Edward I had no intention of executing Wallace quickly. That would have been mercy, and mercy was not in the king's design. Wallace was too valuable, not as a prisoner but as a trophy, a living monument of what awaited those who defied English rule. Edward would not simply kill him, he would display him. So the journey began. Bound in chains, Wallace was paraded through the countryside like a captured beast. From village to village, town to town, he was shown to the people, not to inspire pity, but fear. Children pointed and laughed. Soldiers jeered. The curious came to stare. Some whispered his name with awe, others spat it like poison. But through it all, Wallace did not bow his head. Though his body was bruised and torn, his eyes remained sharp, watching, remembering. In truth, it was not only Wallace on display. It was Edward's warning, paraded through the very heart of his dominion. Rebel, and this is your fate. The journey took weeks, and with each mile the humiliation deepened. They stripped him of his humanity. No comfort, no privacy, no dignity. By the time he reached the gates of London, Wallace was no longer just a man. He was a symbol captured, a dream bound in iron. And yet, as the crowds gathered to gawk at the man they had heard whispered about in legends, one truth remained unshaken. Wallace may have been betrayed. He may have been chained. But he had not been broken. Not yet. The date was August 23, 1305. The place: Westminster Hall, a grand and echoing chamber of stone and shadow, where the weight of centuries pressed down on its ancient walls. That morning it was not a king who entered, nor a lord, but a man in chains, a rebel, a legend, a threat. William Wallace was led into the hall with iron binding his wrists and ankles, his clothes torn and stained from weeks of public degradation. He stood alone, surrounded by nobles, judges, clerics, and scribes, none of whom were there to listen. The trial had no jury, no defense, no fairness. It was, from the beginning, a spectacle. The charges rolled off the tongues of his accusers like poetry rehearsed. treason against the crown, murder of English soldiers, sacrilege against the church, arson, theft, rebellion. Wallace stood silent at first. He did not understand the Latin in which the charges were read. Perhaps they didn't care. Or perhaps that was the point. He was not being tried for what he had done. He was being condemned for what he represented. But when given the chance to speak, Wallace raised his head, not to plead, but to proclaim. I have never sworn allegiance to Edward. He is not my king. I cannot be guilty of treason against a man I owe no loyalty. The room froze for a moment. Not out of respect, but from the sting of truth. The judges glanced at one another, their expressions rigid. But nothing changed. The sentence had been decided long before Wallace ever stepped into that hall. Still, his words echoed bold and unshaken, in a space where no courage was expected to live. He did not beg for his life. He did not renounce his cause. He stood, wounded and betrayed, before the empire that sought to erase him, and he remained unbroken. The sentence was delivered with ceremonial gravity, dressed in legal language meant to veil its cruelty. He would be dragged through the streets of London, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and finally quartered, his body sent to the corners of the realm. It was not justice. It was political theater soaked in blood. The English crown wanted no martyr, no hero, no final words whispered among rebels. They wanted to pulverize a man, and along with him pulverize hope. As Wallace was led away, he did not look back. There was nothing left behind him. Only the cold machinery of power grinding onward, indifferent, relentless, and cloaked in the pretense of law. The trial had done what it was designed to do. Not to judge a man's guilt, but to justify his destruction. And on that day justice died not with a sword, but beneath the crushing weight of silence, fear, and kings. The morning of William Wallace's execution dawned bright and eerily cheerful. In the streets of London, there was no silence, no mourning, only celebration. Vendors lined the roads with carts full of roasted meat, tankards of ale, sweet buns, and cheap trinkets. Children darted through the crowd, laughing. Hawkers shouted about the great show to come, as if the brutal death of a man was just another market-day spectacle. It wasn't justice. It was entertainment. The execution of William Wallace had been planned like a royal parade. The city had prepared for days. Scaffolds built, routes cleared, and word spread far and wide. People came from neighboring villages. Nobles secured their balconies, and apprentices left their shops early, all for the chance to watch a man be torn apart. And when Wallace appeared, chained to a wooden hurdle, dragged behind a pair of horses, the crowd erupted. He wasn't standing. He couldn't. Tied tightly to the frame, his body bounced and scraped across every cobblestone. The sharp stones tore his skin, slicing open his arms, his back, the side of his face. Blood smeared the stones behind him like a trail of shame. But still he made no sound. The people lining the route jeered, mocked, and threw refuse. Rotten vegetables, mud, and worse. Some spat. Others laughed. A few simply stared, silent and pale, as the spectacle passed. To them, this wasn't William Wallace, the freedom fighter. This was a beaten animal dragged out for their pleasure. The English crown had worked hard to reduce him to this, a breathing, bleeding warning painted in flesh. But to those who looked closely, to those who dared meet his gaze, there was something else. He was still watching, still aware, still defiant. The route through London was chosen carefully, not for efficiency, but for humiliation. Every turn was designed to showcase the prisoner. Past markets, through the heart of the city, near churches and taverns, everywhere the people could see what became of rebels. The noise was constant. Boots pounding, merchants shouting, laughter, metal dragging on stone, and above it all, the crack of whips and the cheers of thousands. Children were lifted onto shoulders to catch a glimpse of the man whose name had once struck fear into English hearts. But now he was just a broken body on a board. Or so they thought. The execution hadn't even begun. This was just the opening act, the theatrical prologue to a deeper horror. But even now, Edward's message rang clear. This is what happens to those who defy us. Not just death, but spectacle. Not just punishment, but degradation. They weren't just killing Wallace. They were trying to kill the idea of him, to strip him of myth, of dignity, of defiance, until he was just meat. But as the cart neared Smithfield, the place of execution, Wallace's eyes remained open, unfaltering, fixed somewhere beyond the scaffold, somewhere the crown could never reach. At last, the procession reached Smithfield, London's infamous field of death. The sun hovered high, bright and indifferent, casting long shadows over the sea of spectators who had waited all morning for this moment. A wooden scaffold towered over the field like a gallows-shaped monument, grim and solemn, its rough beams already darkened by countless past executions. But today's spectacle was different. Today was not about swift punishment. It was about slow disintegration. William Wallace, battered and bloodied, was dragged from the cart and forced to his feet. His limbs trembled not from fear, but from days of abuse, from the weight of iron shackles, and from blood lost along the miles of stone. Yet his back was straight. His head was high. The crowd pressed forward. Children sat on shoulders. Vendors passed tankards of ale. Nobles watched from raised platforms draped in velvet. This wasn't a solemn rite. It was a public celebration of annihilation. Wallace was led to the noose. The hangman, a large man with steady hands and dead eyes, stepped forward and tightened the rope around his neck. But not too tightly. He had been instructed carefully. This was not to be a clean death. The rope was measured, calculated precisely to ensure it would not break the neck. Only enough tension to strangle, not snap. Then, the executioner kicked the support out from beneath Wallace's feet. The world seemed to go still. Wallace's body dropped suddenly, the rope catching him mid-air. His muscles convulsed, legs kicked violently, and his chest heaved in desperate attempts to breathe. The crowd leaned in, watching his struggle. Some gasped, others laughed. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. Veins bulged at his temples. His jaw clenched, lips stretching back in a silent grimace of defiance and suffering. But just as his limbs began to fall still, just as unconsciousness approached, he was cut down, gasping, trembling, still alive. The air stabbed back into his lungs like fire. He had not died, because they did not want him to die. Not yet. This moment was only the beginning. The crowd roared, not in sympathy, but in thrill. They had come to see the mighty fall, to witness the undoing of a man who had dared to defy a king. But even then, as Wallace lay collapsed on the scaffold, the rope burned into his neck, his body shaking from oxygen deprivation. His eyes remained open, and those eyes still burned. The English had dragged him, humiliated him, and now choked him on a public stage. But they had not extinguished the flame. Not yet. They would try again with sharper tools and crueler hands. And the nightmare that Edward Longshanks had planned so meticulously was only just beginning. The crowd had seen hangings before. They had seen thieves punished, murderers swing, rebels broken. But what they witnessed next was something different. Something so vile, so deliberate, that even hardened soldiers looked away. William Wallace, barely clinging to consciousness after the botched hanging, was now sprawled atop the execution platform. His chest rose in ragged gasps, his hands still bound, his flesh broken and bruised. But his eyes still burned. The executioner, a man chosen not for mercy but for skill in prolonging agony, approached with a gleaming blade. No ceremony, no announcement, just a quiet shift in the air and then a deep, deliberate cut to the abdomen. Wallace's body convulsed violently as the first incision was made. His head arched back, his teeth clenched, and then came the sound, a sound that would haunt all who heard it. Chroniclers described it as a scream not of this world, but one born of the abyss. A sound that seemed to carry not just pain, but a fury deeper than flesh. It wasn't just the agony of torn muscle. It was betrayal, humiliation, the death of a cause, all released in a single unholy cry. The crowd, moments before braying with laughter, fell silent. One by one, the executioner pulled the organs from Wallace's body, holding them high like trophies before tossing them into a brazier prepared nearby. Flames crackled, consuming the steaming entrails. The air filled with a stench that made stomachs churn. Burnt blood, bile, and something else, something human. In medieval belief, the intestines were thought to hold the seat of mercy, love, and spirit. By destroying them in front of Wallace's own eyes, the crown wasn't just torturing his body, it was symbolically erasing his humanity, reducing him to a creature, a warning. And still, he did not look away. Through bloodied lashes, Wallace watched the smoke rise from his own insides. Some said his lips moved, that he tried to speak. A whisper of defiance? A prayer? No one recorded the words. History, in all its cruelty, lost them. But witnesses would never forget the sight of his stare. Unblinking, locked on something far beyond the scaffold. This was the moment Edward had wanted. Not just death, but degradation. Not just execution, but psychological ruin. To make an example so complete, so grotesque, that the very memory of rebellion would feel nauseating. But something went wrong, because Wallace didn't break. Not when they paraded him, not when they choked him, and not now, as his very soul was ripped apart for the delight of a crowd. In that moment, surrounded by horror, William Wallace became more than flesh. He became defiance incarnate. And the executioner's knife, no matter how deep, couldn't cut that away. At last it came. After the parade of humiliation, after the choking rope, after the fire and the blade and the breaking of flesh, William Wallace still lived. Barely. His body had been shattered, his strength spent, but his spirit had endured long past what any man should have withstood. And yet, even that final act of defiance would be silenced. The executioner, at last, raised his axe. No words were spoken, no rites performed, just a clean, deliberate strike. A single blow that severed the head of Scotland's most defiant son. Blood spilled across the scaffold, steam rising from where it touched the warm wood. The crowd, some pale with awe, others cheering with grotesque satisfaction, watched as the executioner lifted the severed head high. But Edward's vengeance had not yet run dry. Wallace's head was not laid to rest. There would be no tomb, no stone, no prayer. Instead, it was dipped in boiling tar, preserved in chemical fire to keep it from decay, and placed upon a spike atop London Bridge, where thousands would pass beneath its lifeless gaze. There, above the Thames, the symbol of Scottish rebellion watched the city that had cheered his undoing. And still, it wasn't over. Wallace's body, what remained of it, was treated with equal contempt. His limbs were separated, carved apart not for burial, but for display. Each quarter was sent north, to the corners of the realm he had fought to free. Stirling, Perth, Berwick, and Newcastle. In these towns, his remains were nailed high on gates and walls, where they hung in open air, not to honor the fallen, but to terrify the living. They were not pieces of a man. They were messages. To the farmers, the blacksmiths, the sons and daughters of Scotland who still harbored thoughts of resistance. Each limb was a word. Each city, a sentence. The message, clear: defy England, and this is what becomes of you. But in trying to destroy him so completely, Edward had done something else. Something unintended. He had scorched Wallace into legend. Because limbs decay, heads rot, tar fades, but memory does not. In the eyes of the English, Wallace had been reduced to a warning. Meat and bone and iron spikes. But in the hearts of the Scots, he became something eternal. They did not see his torn body. They saw the man who never bowed. They whispered his name not in fear, but in reverence. And though the king had claimed his head and quartered his remains, he could not cut the idea of William Wallace apart. Because death is not the end of every man. And for Wallace, it was only the beginning. King Edward I believed he had won. He had paraded William Wallace through the streets like a captured beast. He had starved him, strangled him, carved him, and displayed his remains like cursed trophies across four corners of the kingdom. He had turned a man into a message, one written in blood and nailed to the gates of cities. To Edward, the matter was finished. Wallace was gone. The rebellion surely would die with him. But Edward was wrong, because Wallace's death did not extinguish the fire in Scotland. It ignited it. The spectacle he had arranged with such precision, the public torment, the execution designed to horrify and humiliate, had the opposite effect. What was meant to be a deterrent became a rallying cry. In the quiet glens and stone halls of Scotland, word of Wallace's fate spread like wildfire. Farmers repeated the story by candlelight. Priests whispered it from pulpits. Warriors sat in silence, imagining the screams and the smoke. And one man in particular listened closely, Robert the Bruce. Once a cautious nobleman who walked the fine line between politics and patriotism, Robert was transformed by what he heard. He saw, through the brutality, a deeper truth. The English crown would never rule Scotland with mercy. Only chains. Wallace's final moments, his suffering, his silence, his defiance, etched themselves into Robert's soul. And where once he had hesitated, now he stood firm. Because Wallace had shown the cost of resistance, and also its worth. Across the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands, fear began to die. In its place rose something far more dangerous, conviction. Edward had succeeded in creating a legend, but not the kind he had hoped for. He had turned William Wallace into a martyr, and martyrs do not die. They grow. They become stories. They become banners. They become reasons. Men who once submitted now remembered Wallace's name with reverence. Women taught their children that freedom was not bought with words but with blood. And those who had turned away in fear now raised their swords. The legacy of Wallace, far from buried, was reborn in fire. Within a few short years, Robert the Bruce would raise that banner of resistance again. He would fight. He would lose. And then he would fight again. Until finally, at Bannockburn, Scotland would stand not as a subject land, but as a kingdom free. And when they cheered that day years later, it was not just for Bruce. It was for Wallace, the man who had died screaming and unbowed, and who, in doing so, taught a nation how to stop kneeling. Edward had tried to end a rebellion. Instead, he forged a revolution. Centuries have passed since the morning William Wallace was dragged through the streets of London, bound in chains, and laid upon the scaffold at Smithfield. And yet his name still burns, not as a king, not as a conqueror, but as something greater, a symbol, a reminder, a warning. Wallace's death was not simply an execution. It was a performance, choreographed by the English crown to display dominance, to instill terror, to break the soul of a nation. Every act of cruelty that day, the rope, the blade, the fire, was done not in the name of law but of control. But such control came at a cost, because the horror inflicted upon William Wallace did not fade with his last breath. It did not vanish with the flames or scatter with the ashes of his broken body. Instead, it took root, deep within the Scottish spirit. His agony became their memory, his silence became their vow, and his resistance became their heritage. Across generations, his story passed from mouth to mouth, carved into wood, painted on banners, sung in ballads whispered by firelight. The manner of his death was too brutal to forget, and too meaningful to ignore. Wallace became more than a man. He became a mirror, reflecting both the nobility of sacrifice and the monstrousness of unchecked power. For the Scottish people, he was the embodiment of freedom, not because he won, but because he never surrendered. He showed them that dignity could endure even in the face of mutilation, and that ideals could survive the death of flesh. He taught them that sometimes the body must be destroyed so that the soul of a nation might live. But his legacy extended further still. For even beyond Scotland, the memory of William Wallace whispered through the dark corridors of empires. He became a case study in what happens when rulers believe fear is stronger than justice, when cruelty is used not just to punish but to send a message. What happened at Smithfield that day was not merely a historical footnote. It was a political ritual, meant to silence a voice, but instead amplifying it across centuries. and the silence that followed his scream became deafening. Wallace's death serves as a warning that history records not only the victories of kings, but the suffering of those they sought to erase. That justice, when corrupted, can create martyrs more powerful than armies. That power, when twisted, leaves scars not only on bodies, but on time itself. And so, long after Edward's crown turned to dust, long after scaffolds crumbled and banners faded, one name endured: William Wallace, not because he ruled, but because he refused to kneel.